Imagine the perfect video store. It would have a great selection, right? Right! Over 10,000 videos. 3 evening rentals, so no rush, no hassle.
At the risk of sounding like a total boomer, kids and younger people today will never really know the joys or excitement of going to your local video rental store on a Friday night and browsing through tons of VHS movies. Each weekend, going to the video rental store for me was a frickin' event, and I remember spending so much time just looking at and admiring so many different films on the shelves. And maybe more than any other genre, I remember being most fascinated by the movies in the horror section. Being a young kid in the early 90s, most of these horror movies I browsed were various 80s and early 90s horror films that are now considered classics, and a few were probably best left forgotten as well. The VHS cover art for these films was so captivating, and I probably spent more time taking in how awesome, disturbing, and spooky these covers were than actually renting and watching the movies themselves. Of course, my curiosity eventually got the best of me, and I actually started renting some of these horror VHS tapes to see how spooky they really were. I remember renting Child's Play, Aliens, Halloween 3, and Tales from Darkside with a blanket at the ready to cover up as soon as things got too scary or gruesome. Eventually, I became pretty desensitized to horror movies, and after countless nightmares, I eventually developed an appreciation and love for these films. While there are various horror movies released after the late 90s that I enjoy, I find that 90% of the horror movies I really love were made between the early 80s to the early to mid 90s. The horror genre during this time had just so much damn charm to it, and the use of practical effects, 80s style and aesthetic, and that undeniable 80s cheese just makes these movies impossible not to love. Little did I know at the time when I was first watching these films that there was actually an arcade game floating around that somehow captured all the charm and essence of horror movies from that era. Night Slashers is a beat-em-up released by Data East in 1993 that combined various horror staples like zombies, werewolves, vampires, and mummies, and combined them with amazing-looking sprite-based graphics. Maybe others remember this game from back in the day, but it certainly wasn't at any of my local arcades during the 90s. In fact, several of my local childhood arcades had The Simpsons, another local arcade had a 6-player X-Men cabinet, and I'd also see the occasional Final Fight cab here and there as well. However, this one was nowhere to be found. Because of this, I was completely ignorant to the existence of Night Slashers literally up until a few months ago. I know, pretty lame, right? But regardless, as soon as I discovered its existence and saw Night Slashers gameplay, I knew I had to drop everything I was doing and play it right away. And that's precisely what I did. Since discovering Night Slashers, I probably played through it close to 10 times, and each time it left me with that warm, fuzzy feeling inside that at first I was unable to identify. I later realized it conjured up the same feelings I had for all those campy 80s horror movies I loved as a kid, which was just enhanced even more by the period-appropriate graphics and art direction of this game. Oh, and, on top of that, this game's a freaking blast to play as well. And with that, let's jump into Night Slashers and look at why this game is so awesome and why it's a must-play for retro beat-em-up fans and 80s horror movie fans alike. In general, the beat-em-up genre really isn't known for its depth and complexity. You're pretty much just mashing a single attack button while also hitting a jump button occasionally as well, while you fight wave after wave after wave of the same 10 or so enemy sprites with the occasional boss here or there. This simplicity was both responsible for beat-em-ups becoming hugely popular in the 80s and early 90s arcades, as well as its downfall by the late 90s. Typically, by the time you get 2/3 through any beat-em-up game, you're pretty much ready for it to be over with, given how monotonous and repetitive many of them are. This is why a lot of beat-em-ups heavily relied on things like licensing to make them more interesting and appealing to arcade goers. I mean, let's just be honest for a sec. The Simpsons and Alien vs. Predator would not have been nearly as popular or fondly remembered if not for their popular IPs. Sadly, this is probably the main reason Night Slashers is remembered by very few and talked about by even fewer. However, that doesn't mean Night Slashers was a boring, forgettable game. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Night Slashers takes place during a paranormal apocalypse where creatures of darkness have overwhelmed humanity and civilization to the point where both are on the brink of annihilation. Not if the Night Slashers have anything to say about it, though. The Night Slashers are a group of 3 badass playable characters you get to choose from that literally specialize in liquefying whatever they touch. Yeah, Van Helsing doesn't have shit on these 3. But yeah, the Night Slashers include Jake Hunter, a psychic cyborg with a square jaw, hair metal blonde locks, and American flag stripes on his back. Okay, I'm just gonna stop right there and say that alone makes this game amazing. Okay, calm down, Wiggles, calm down. But anyhow, the second character is the European vampire hunting kung fu master Christopher Smith, and then finally we have the Chinese Chinese demon-exorcising badass Hong Hu Zhao. Using one of these three characters, you'll be fighting your way through a hospital overrun with zombies before taking on a mad scientist and later his Frankenstein monster creation. You'll then be in pursuit of a vampire overlord who looks like Van Halen Dracula, and later realize he's actually not the guy behind the world going to shit. This then leads you to the dark underworld itself, where you'll then take on two goofy-looking predators before later fighting Kung Fu King Tut on a cargo plane. Soon after, you'll catch up with the Grim Reaper himself, who was behind all of this. Oh, but wait, what? He actually wasn't? This will lead you to the final boss battle against the actual mastermind behind the paranormal apocalypse, a demon overlord in a giant cyber demon suit named King Zaratz. To piece together this crazy-ass story, there are cool cutscenes between stages, as well as multiple endings depending on who you beat the game as. And before moving into Night Slasher's gameplay, let's just appreciate for a minute how amazing this story is. Sure, it's not Citizen Kane or The English Patient, but honestly, it's way better. I mean, fighting a martial arts mummy on a plane, taking out a vampire that looks like he snorts lines of coke off a guitar, and also literally punching a helicopter to death is pretty much exactly what I'd expect from some of the crappiest, cheesiest, yet most amazing 80s horror movies I used to rent. I told you this game was awesome. But let's move on to Night Slasher's surprisingly decent gameplay. In terms of gameplay, Night Slashers actually does a slightly better job than most other beat-em-ups in the early 90s. While there are minor differences on how each character controls as well as their strength and dexterity, I found that most of these differences are fairly negligible for the most part. Hong Hua is definitely the fastest of the three, but in terms of strength or endurance, they all pretty much seem the same. It would make sense that Jake would be the most powerful since he's also the slowest, but if he was, I barely noticed. But whatever. Aside from these differences, all characters have grabs, throws, 360-degree attacks, and specials that all look different between them, but are more or less functionally the same. There are also random items that you can pick up and use, including various weapons, power-ups, and health items to assist you in getting through each stage. Unfortunately, I found most of these items to be less useful than they typically are in most other beat-em-ups I've played. All the weapons are one-off use, meaning you can't bludgeon 3 or 4 zombies before the weapon expires. I mean, yeah, that kinda sucks. Each character also has 2 special moves, one performed while on the ground and one while in the air. These specials fill the entire screen and are a great way to clear up multiple enemies at once or deal big damage to the game's bosses. Using these specials uses a large chunk of your life bar, meaning you have to decide whether it's more important to preserve your health or if killing everything on the screen is a wiser decision. The 360-degree attacks that each character has also use your life energy, albeit less than the special attacks. While the gameplay is more or less what you'd expect from an action-packed beat-em-up game, maybe even slightly better given its variety, what certainly helps Night Slashers stand out from the rest of the pack are its graphics and visuals. More than any other beat-em-up I've ever played, Night Slashers is violent and gory as hell. I mean, yep, Night Slashers might be the most violent old-school beat-em-up game ever made. Killing an enemy will result in one of several gruesome death animations ranging from heads exploding, guts rupturing, total dismemberment, and even just turning into liquid mush. You can even drive an enemy into the ground and then proceed to bash their head in with your foot. The gratuitous gore is definitely on par with similar over-the-top ridiculous gore effects found in 80s horror movies, and seeing the various enemy types die in these ways just never gets old. Speaking of the game's enemies and bosses, various staples of the horror genre are well represented in this game. I already went over most of the bosses you'll end up fighting in this game, but as far as the standard enemies go, they also encapsulate many iconic horror tropes. Pretty much, you'll be beating the shit out of countless zombies, werewolves, vampires, mass killers, and possessed paintings? Okay. But combined with the game's cool stages, these characters fit in perfectly with the rest of the game and look freaking amazing. This is in no small part to how well done the sprite-based graphics look and how much detail is crammed into this nearly 30-year-old game. Everything from body bags in a morgue falling off the shelf and zombies coming out of them, to those killer paintings coming off the wall and transforming into fire demons is just awesome. In fact, the graphics in Night Slasher is only rivaled by one other aspect of this game: its outstanding audio. Going into this game, I knew mostly what to expect in terms of gameplay. Even the game's visuals and graphics, while amazing, didn't surprise me significantly more than what I was expecting. However, Night Slasher's OST literally had me floored with how good it is. It's actually so good that I could have been fooled into thinking this game's soundtrack was composed for a much more well-known game like Streets of Rage or Street Fighter 2. It's literally that good. In terms of non-soundtrack audio, the game's various enemies and bosses will let out a variety of moans, screams, and growls while fighting them. This is combined with cool sound effects like the sound of your fists hitting the enemies or hearing their bodies get suplexed into the ground with the force of a meteor hitting the earth. Or there's my favorite sound effect, the sound of bone and flesh spontaneously turning into runny paste. Anyone else hungry? But more than these sound effects is the hilarious and awesome voice acting between the main characters and bosses. Each interaction will have a text box appear, however characters will also deliver some goofball one-liners right before you start to fight. These lines are pretty ridiculous, and funny enough, they aren't even included in the dialogue box at all. I guess it's what they say after the dialogue box? I don't know. But regardless, the voice acting lands square in the middle of that so bad it's good category, and will have you on the floor at times. I'm honestly at an utter loss why this game isn't mentioned in the same breath as Final Fight, Turtles in Time, or Alien vs. Predator when discussing the best 90s beat-em-ups. Despite not being based on any sort of licensed property, Night Slashers carries itself, and it's honestly more entertaining and fun than a decent chunk of those beat-em-ups based on licensed IPs. I am completely serious about that too. Night Slashers is a freaking arcade gem if there ever was one, and it's pretty sad this game has mostly been forgotten. Unfortunately, even a modern release on the Nintendo eShop couldn't save this game from the dustbins of 90s arcade obscurity. Despite how forgotten and obscure this game is, I highly recommend anyone watching this video go on the eShop, or hell, even get MAME fired up and try out this outstanding forgotten arcade beat-em-up gem. You'll have an insanely good time, and an even better time if you love old 80s horror films like I do. But anyhow, that's Night Slashers. Yeah, just play it, like, now. But wait, before you do, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment below. And again, thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a good one.